Give me a little bit of talk. Give me a little bit of jab.
Hey, how's it going? Hey, hi. How's it going? Little jab here, little jab there.
There we go. Can y'all hear this fool? Can you hear this fool?
Yep. Dude, your impressions were awesome. I watched that video twice.
Thank you. I appreciate it. Yeah, anytime you do a video like that, you'll get like 300 likes, and then you'll get 10 dislikes, and then all these comments that people say they like it, and then you focus on the one comment where it's like, your impressions are shit. You're the worst impressionist I've ever heard in my whole life. And then it's like, dang,
I know. Oh, I get that because people are used to my memes, so they just like my memes. So if I do like a face swap or an impression or a short video, they're like, I didn't come here for the video. Yeah. Just like, this is me.
Yeah.
Just calm down.
I remember when I started having more subscribers on the YouTube channel, I would post the comedic silly stuff, and I'd get a lot of comments. People like, I'm here for lectures. I am here for philosophy. I'm not here for shitty comedy. I'm like, there's always been crappy comedy at my YouTube channel. What are you talking about? The first video I ever uploaded was crappy comedy, and it will always be there. So it's not going away. And you should have hipped yourself to that. But welcome, everybody. We got JimBob back in the house, made by JimBob. Let me I forgot to add his Instagram to that descriptor. Your Instagram is
made by
gayascrap.com.
Gay as shit. Scribbles.
Gayasshit.com, bro. Is that your website?
Ignorant scribbles.
Made by JimBob. Insta. There we go. All right. So I figured we'd talk about the climate cult, the new religion, Greta, and that kind of stuff. And then, that would kind of be a springboard. We could branch off into talking about philosophy, ultimate principles. How do we view the world? How do we view nature? How do we view social justice, religion, logic? All those different topics. Is that cool with you?
Sounds awesome.
And you did have some really based, awesome scribbles this week. So everybody check out. I really enjoyed the Stefan Hawking. I think you had the redo, or you had the.
Well, yeah, they shut that down. Yeah. My Greta Thunberg Hitler was it's still up on Facebook. It's like, it's getting over like 70,000 right now. And I'm like, how is that up? It's literally Hitler with braids. And, nice. But if I make a cartoon of Stephen Hawking going to Epstein Island, it's in 30 seconds, a 30-second thing. And they just took it down so fast. It's because he's godly. He's like, talk about a new religion. He's like, no, you cannot. He's not only in a wheelchair. He talks funny, but he knows a lot of stuff that we can't understand, but we trust him.
We broke that story on Boiler Room. We actually broke that story because I was actually with him. I rode in. I hopped up on his lap, and he wheeled me around on Epstein's Island, and we were going up a hill to go to the temple, and his thing toppled over in the back. It's run on like 50 AA batteries, and all the batteries toppled out and rolled down the hill. I had to gather them all up, stick them back in the wheelchair as he rolled me up to the orgy, and that's how I was able to break that story on Boiler Room.
Right. Yeah. So they took that down, and then I was like, all right, I'll just put up a 5-second clip of him in the Eyes Wide Shut mask looking around with the piano in the background. And that actually was almost more effective because it was just, there's no talking. It was just him like witnessing.
And for me, which I do appreciate, I'm cageified. So you gave me the cage treatment. We always welcome the cage treatment. Now, I didn't see this other video of you with you look like you have Jared Leto's face with your beard. Whose face is that?
Oh, that's it.
Ben Shapiro?
It's unfortunate that it's Ben Shapiro, but my beard stops me from doing a lot of people because it just doesn't work. I tried George Soros. I'm looking at him like, nope.
Yeah, well, I was.
So
I can't really do that good of a Ben Shapiro, but when I was practicing it before I made that video last night, I was like, you know what? All I got to do is just speed this up with the speed thing, and Final Cut, and it's like, in Tractate 23 of the Babylonian Talmud, and I was just like, just say a bunch of stuff that's, sounds.
Say a lot of fast things, a couple of extra
philosophy, logic,
words.
contradiction, climate change, social justice, blah, 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 blah.
Yeah, he's fun of, because especially all like my right-leaning boomer people, they get so excited when I attack like low-hanging fruit lefty social justice
and then they're
bullshit.
Mad if you criticize.
And then they just get so mad. They're just like, don't.
Why are you hating on the conservatives? Exactly. Why are you hating on people on our side?
Exactly, my side, the side.
Why are you punching right?
Yeah, exactly.
Punching. More like girl slapping
barely
on the right.
Yeah, exactly.
All right, so
exactly.
So let's see. So you've had some winners this week. You've had quite a few hits here. Let's see. Which ones can we put up safely? Let's see. Let's see the Bernie one. That one's pretty good. Let's put the Bernie one up. Bernie says, "We need to have gun control, and then we need to have rent control, and then we need to have the full control."
Exactly.
That's a good one. Let's see. Let me add that one. So we got a little Barney in the house. If you got him, Barney him. So there's our Barney. Sorry, there's many, many more. The Instagram is added now to the description. My mind is out. I'm kind of tired today. I had to do a whole talk on Aquinas for the subscribers to Jay's Analysis, so my mind's kind of mushed today. But we will power through. All right, so let's talk about Greta. I'm glad that you did cartoonize her and immortalize her. It was funny. Tristan actually called my attention to Greta probably a month or two ago. I didn't even know who this was, why this mattered, and I remember Tristan was talking about it. I was like, who is this girl? Who cares what some... I thought she's like a 10-year-old. Oh, it turns out she's actually almost an adult, because that was by design, by the way, because that way nobody can make fun of her, criticize her, because then all the idiot boomer liberals who actually came after me on my social media, they were like, "Why are you making fun of a kid? That's unbelievable. I can't believe you would make fun of a kid." And meanwhile, the system promotes pedophilia, but don't make a joke about a kid. And by the way, she's not.
Nope, just
she's
rape
not
them.
10. She's actually 16, almost an adult. Anyway, what do you think?
Yeah, I mean, I didn't know much about her. I saw a couple of early kind of clips of her, and I knew that she would get propped up closer to the election, and I knew they were grooming her. I didn't know the full backstory. I don't know how much of it is true, all the connections to the early climate change pioneers and Freemasonry kind of stuff. I usually don't go full on with that, because it's hard to validate, to like, but she's a tool. I mean, her parents are like never were famous. One's an opera singer, one's an actor. She's now listed as an actor on IMDb, the daughter, Greta. And this is how it is now. It's like the same way Ocasio-Cortez tried out for Congress in a literal audition. We have to kind of get used to this sort of total overlap of politics and entertainment. It could have always been like this, but now it's just kind of like rooted, and there's a lot more you can do with media. So everything happens faster, and the process is like streamlined. You can literally, for cheap, make a product out of a person and a narrative out of a person in a way that we've never seen before. And we could do it this week if we wanted. We could like create Jay and do a character about climate change, pushing that narrative, and we could probably get you popular in a month.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? So it's just, sometimes I don't get too crazy about like, this is crazy, because if you just step back, you're like, oh yeah, this makes sense. This makes complete sense. And it's all, people have to understand, it's not about her, it's about Agenda 21, and it's about starting with centralized regional planopolises. Exactly. And they want to do that. They know that globalism and controlling food and resources and energy, you can't just skip to um, a, a standardized global system. You have to start regional, and that's cities. And so they're going to push these really great cities with no cars and small spaces. I like how they're pushing. Sorry, it's a little tangent, but like it's all connected. Little tiny houses. Like I started watching that, and I even got hooked early on. Like, oh, I could do that. That sounds so cool and cozy, and it's reduced and minimal. And they're pushing minimalism and all this stuff, and you realize, holy shit! Like they're pushing compact living, minimal living, almost like outdoor jail living, but like nice.
Yeah.
You know, and
Yeah. Well,
that's going to be a part of the push too.
yeah. The first thing it makes me think of is Maoism. Mao is really who pioneered this idea of the youth brigades. I mean, you could go back in revolutionary thought prior to Mao, where there were ideas of using kids, using the youth, but really Mao pioneered this because he was able to convince the youth that they were special, they were the cutting edge, they were like the generation that was destined to overthrow the prior, Chinese traditions. And so he marshaled that energy of youth, which is tremendous but super dumb. You are so dumb when you're a kid. You think you know things, especially when you're propagandized in a system that teaches you all this kind of collectivism and whatnot. And so Maoism was really good at that. And it's exact same strategy and modus operandi of how to utilize not just youthful energy, but also to utilize the youth in the propaganda. And that's why, for example, even aside from Maoism, I mean, military recruitment, it goes for young guys, right? Because young guys are dumb. Young guys fall for the propaganda. They fall for the fact that they think that they're going to be fighting for, American ideals or whatever, patriotism, and they're actually fighting for Coke and Pepsi and vaccines and abortion and that kind of stuff, right? They're fighting to have. I did a joke video a long time ago that the algorithm didn't like. I thought it was pretty good, but it was a drill sergeant who was shouting at the guys to that they were going to be fighting and giving their lives for footlongs. I mean, that's actually
a good commercial.
I mean, that was like a true commercial, right? So you're dying for Subway. Anyway, but the point is that's the propagandist origin of this. We've seen it more recently. I remember 21st Century Wire did a really good job covering the whole Syrian situation. There was a lot of propaganda at the time of Syria with Dusty Boy. Dusty Boy was a child that was used. They pasted all over everywhere, and this was to topple Assad. The same kinds of thing that we saw the Bush PR firm put out about Saddam Hussein throwing babies out of incubators. They threw the babies out of the incubators. That was all fake. It was all staged. Kids, once again, babies, right? We've seen this over and over and over. And so it's a very basic style tactic. Events that I won't go into that I'm sure everybody knows. More recent events with kids that come out. Ha, kids! Right, as the face of these events, and then we're supposed to be lectured by a bunch of 10-year-olds, 12-year-olds, 13-year-olds who don't know anything about anything. And then, but I was actually kind of shocked when I listened to the chick giving her speech, because I didn't realize it was that. Like, whoa, dude, she's like really calling for trying to put the guilt trip on people, right? Like you have stolen my future. It also ties into
her parents.
It ties into what you said about propping up people that have neurological disorders, autism.
Yeah, it's a protective shield. It's not only they're easier to control, but the protective aspect is pretty genius. Because I mean, we've seen it they started with just minorities, and then you add in another victim group, and then you keep adding them, and I could make a list of them, and then you can't make fun of you can't criticize Israel because that's anti-Semitic. And now we're getting to this like neurodiverse stuff where if you start making these kinds of people the spokespeople, it's a really good trick, because you can just be like, just like Hillary, like you just hate women, and now it's gonna be like you can't make fun of her, and it's
don't forget Obama. With
Yeah,
Obama,
exactly.
it was a case of skin color.
Right.
And then it was with Hillary,
Right.
it was gender, right? And then now
Yeah.
they're just extending it to basically any possible identity is going to
Yeah.
somehow be under some kind of protected class. Exactly, and that's by
But
design.
there's
Yeah, we started noticing that too. That was by design, but I like that people are figuring out, because we used to talk about this on the old Hoaxbusters podcast with John and Chris, where we would cover the fact that people are, it's almost like they audition for roles, like they audition to get the role, not just in a movie or whatever, but to be the face of a movement.
yeah.
And I think some of the pop stars have done this actually, like they want to be the face of whatever agenda. It doesn't matter.
Right.
Let's say veganism. This is something that we've noticed a lot with Tristan, pointing out a lot of these people sort of being picked out in YouTube, in the YouTube crowd, and so, oh, you're going to be the face of, YouTube veganism, and Saudi Prince Al Walid or whatever his name is, billionaire. There's dad's got Trump's yacht or whatever. Then he puts money into this YouTube channel, right? And that's what happens, is that people are auditioning to be the face of different movements, and we see that really clear with Greta. And one last point I wanted to make was that that whole coffin apartment thing that you were talking about, tiny living. I see the millennials just totally buying into this wholesale. And just on the movie tip, Jodorowsky's Holy Mountain, if you don't know, which I'm not necessarily recommending this film. It's a really degenerate movie, but there's a unique scene in the film where they're talking about future cities, kind of like smart cities. They're kind of like box apartment smarts, and they call it a coffin apartment. You lay in this little coffin. That's where you sleep, and you slide you into the wall of the Walmart or whatever, or the right. So I think that there is something prophetic to that movie, in that it does kind of predict this death cult extending to the mega smart cities. And you basically live inside of a target, and then at the appointed time, presumably, then you're incinerated. Maybe you sleep in a little coffin incinerator, like
Wow.
and then it, like when like Logan's Run, when you hit 30 or whatever, it's time to incinerate you.
Well, they'll convince you that they're going to upload your consciousness, and it's not going to be provable. So they're going to be like, no, we did it. There's all this information out there. We did it. We killed you, but we saved a lot of stuff. So that's equivalent, because they're gonna, they're using like AI incorrectly. Like, we don't have AI. We have augmented intelligence, but they're calling it AI. And we don't actually have artificial intelligence, but everyone's running with the term. And the same way they're going to trick people into that kind of stuff. And, everything is sold with like, now it's all virtue, and it's the best thing for the whole nation, or the best thing for the whole. It started with nation, the best thing for the town, the best thing for the city, the best thing for the common good. Is now they're trying to expand the common good to global level. It's not gonna work. Like, it just doesn't work well. Like, even the utilizing protected classes, autistic people and so forth, they're scaling that technique too fast. So it's all collapsing. The fact that it got such a response so quickly, like, people annihilated that speech so fast and that's like the silent majority, who's kind of no longer silent. They're just like, we don't buy this shit. Like, we just don't buy it. So that's the good news. But getting people to understand the intent behind this stuff and the plans, people, you'd say, I feel like they purposely call it like Agenda 21 so that you sound stupid when you try to tell it to somebody, like, oh, that sounds like a conspiracy theory. And then, the early people talking about this, probably yourself, I didn't even really fully dive into it until like last year. But yeah, it's hard to communicate to people because they just don't buy that there's groups of people and companies like Siemens and all these large companies that will win if this centralization takes place, because the government will need suppliers and builders and all that stuff, and they want that full-term, lifelong contract. Basically, this is how life is now, and I think there's enough people that will realize if it's closer, they'll be like, no, we're not going to do this. But there is an element that I think it's inevitable in some places, like some cities, some European countries perhaps will go full on with that program. And they had the whole thing designed. I forgot the entity. It was like they used the tax dollars to hire a private company to come up with the terminology and the phrasing and the outline of these megalopolis kind of centralized cities. And it was called like Growing Smart or something. And there's a whole book on it, actually. There's like the book. I'll try to figure it out, and maybe you could post it after in the comment or in the description. But there's a whole manual about it. So it's like, people who are like, "Oh, you're crazy." No, it's all of this stuff is documented.
Yeah, no, totally. I mean, when I put out Esoteric Hollywood 1, there's a couple chapters where I talked about the smart cities. I talked about it in relationship to Minority Report, Logan's Run, and maybe a couple more. But and then I did a video last year on the Saudi city Neom, which is one of the big smart city projects. But what you were talking about with AI, it reminds me. I did a talk a long time ago, 5 years ago, 4 years ago. I'll put it in the chat right now because I'd totally forgotten this. But I actually did a talk on, there's a famous essay called Minds, Machines, and Gödel. And it's actually a famous argument. I think I'll link the paper in the description. It's posted. Maybe not, but you can look it up. It's a famous sort of Oxford essay, maybe from the 70s, and it's kind of making the argument that you'll never get actual consciousness from AI because artificial intelligence is basically just what you put into it. It's like saying that, oh, one day the math problems will come alive. No, math problems and algorithms are only going to ever be math problems. They're never going to be alive. The number 7 pi is not going to attack you. Okay, it's not going to come alive. It could be programmed to attack you, but that doesn't mean that it's coming alive. And this is one thing we also noticed back when we were doing the old Hoaxbuster shows too, was that point you were hinting at, that a lot of this is sold to you, as a lot of this is propaganda, especially something like that you're going to be downloaded into a computer. You're going to be put on a zip drive, right? Like a damn genie or something. Like, oh yeah, your spirit, it's literally a superstitious level. Like they're going to put you into a zip drive. That's crazy. No, what they're doing is they're playing a sleight of hand where they're talking about if they've recorded you and they've recorded video of you, or maybe even fMRI recorded your thoughts or whatever, right? The argument is that, well, that's you, because you is just these vocal patterns, these imprints, these neurons firing. And so if we record those things, that's you. So therefore we are uploading you to the global brain. But of course that's not you. That's a recording of you. And I know that sounds dumb to people, but I'm not joking. If you look up, there's a video, I can't remember this billionaire's name, but it's a billionaire tech person who is now a she, and the lover died of the person. And so what the guy, or whatever this person is, recorded a bunch of the lover's thoughts, ideas. Like he would do something weird, like sit and record the spouse or whatever for hours every day. And the argument was that this person thought that when it created the AI bot of this person, it would literally be that person because it's that person's thoughts, mannerisms, features, and so it literally shaped the head, into the person's spouse or whatever after it died. I mean, it looks ridiculous. It looks like a damn B. It looks like a B movie. But the point of that was that here you have a tech billionaire who's out of crazy, literally insane, thinking and arguing that this severed head of a black woman robot talking is the lover. It's not. It's a robot head. Right. That's not your lover. It's a robot head. Okay.
Yeah, people will want to sell themselves on that because the level to which they are willing to believe it, if that's matched with how convincing it is. So we can be convinced by illusion that we're seeing something, or that something's really there, or the cat really knows what that sentence meant, like fully, like we experience it. And so we can convince ourselves. it's like those new concave TVs. They're getting to the point, I think it's like 16,000 pixels per square inch is the tipping point to where you can't distinguish reality from a TV. So when they get that, they're replicating the experience of what you perceive to be real, and it's a trick. And so they're able to argue that if it can fool the person, then it must be real because there's no difference. But at that point, it seems like a self-refuting argument, because why you would be fooling yourself to begin with then? So then nothing's real, basically. So those kinds of endeavors are all reduced to being your own god, I think, on a wider baseline thing. I've been in those communities. Like when I left my hometown and went to LA, I immediately ditched religion and God, and I immediately immersed myself into futurism and technology, and I replaced it. I replaced one heuristic for another, and
You're not an AI black woman, are you? Secretly?
no. And so yeah, I was all into that, like all of it. I was all around those guys. Like I was helping produce futurist events. There was like Kurzweil and all those guys. All the investors were around, and I was just infatuated with it all because it's the same concept. It's like we're gonna transcend. There's gonna be a hive mind. It's gonna be and of course, when I finally became honest with myself, I was like, I'm not gonna do any of that. Like I'll talk about it and sell it to people.
I don't know there.
And then I realized
that kind of looks like you. I don't know. So that's the tech billionaire's robot lover, and I could not remember. I dug it up. Martine Rothblatt, and so the lover passed away, and here is the. I mean, these AI, they look like something from a B movie, dude. They don't even look that, like, we're supposed to believe we're in some tech utopia and, oh, dude, it's so advanced. It's so advanced. That looks like something from freaking Valley of the Dolls or some shit. I mean, you may not be able to see it, but it looks goofy. But yeah, so, and that, by the way, points that illustrates the fact that the transmutation agendas, genetic modification, sexuality, they are ultimately about the post-human agenda. That's the whole point of it.
Right. Yeah, they're way ahead in their heads about it. Like they can imagine all this. I remember the feeling of like thinking ahead and be like, it's going to be like this. It's going to be, and you realize that you're only talking to people at like dinner parties about it. And, really things don't move the way you think. Also, there's always backlash. Like people, we're natural beings. There's something that we just hold on to the natural state we're in, and there's always going to be that resistance against those people. And even when it gets to the point where some sort of weird connectivity, like they perfect Neuralink to the point where I can eat a banana and have it taste, and someone else eats ice cream and we both taste both things, and people will get that novelty and get all crazy about it. But it's all silly.
Yeah. Well, I'm looking at a robot with crossed eyes, so yeah. Talk about silly. But yeah, no, it illustrates your point perfectly there. So yeah, I mean, this is not going to become, the only way that you would believe that a robot could evolve into consciousness is to redefine the term consciousness to mean whatever you want it to mean, and that's essentially what I was getting at earlier with just saying that a replica or a mimic, mimesis, that is identical to you, but that's completely absurd. Nobody actually believes that, but it's just kind of a mythology. So yeah, we're right back at mythology, we're right back at superstition. So on Greta too, I did want to mention too that somebody was fussing with me, actually multiple people, about the actress comment. Now they said, look, anytime that you are in a documentary, you're listed on IMDb as an actor. Okay. But the first thing on Greta's filmography was drama. It was not her place in a documentary. It was her place in a drama. And she's in other dramas. So yes, she is an actress in dramas. That means that she is not primarily a genius whiz kid chosen for her, Stefan Molyneux level IQ, but chosen in fact for her role as an actress. And this is something we've seen pretty consistently. Actually, I've called attention to it. I don't want to read too much into this, but nobody has really called attention to the fact, except a couple people, that Fidel Castro has an IMDb page. And not just for being in documentaries about Cuba. Actually, early on, Castro was in Hollywood. He was hanging out with a lot of the Hollywood people. He tried out for the Dodgers, and he has an IMDb page as an extra in different movies back in the 50s. Now, make of that what you will. I'm not trying to make too much out of it, but I did do a talk on the history of the CFR and the relationship to Cuba, according to sort of Servando Gonzalez, which is a good book. But I bring all that up to say that it is worth looking at to talk about the Hollywood side of this, because a lot of people are chosen for these roles, as we said, because they're more or less auditioning. And they might not even know that. I mean, they may have been groomed for this role since they were younger, if their parents were connected. Now, I'm told, I've not done a lot of research into her family, but a lot of people have said that she actually is from a very well-connected family, and from where she's from. But I didn't really even pay that much attention to it, because it's the same thing I've seen over and over and over. I mean, if you've looked at this kind of stuff, for a lot of years, you kind of already know how it works. You know the patterns. It's always the same. They just kind of roll out the same thing over and over, because people don't remember. They don't remember that, oh, that's what they did with Dusty Boy. Dusty Boy was a prop for the Syria operation.
Yeah, people just generally don't remember anything. They just don't recall back and measure the two against each other, because if it's a brand new issue and it's a hot button issue and it's an emotional issue, it's like to them it has nothing to do with the patterns. Like someone like yourself, and someone like Owen Benjamin, the ability to see patterns is really powerful, and to be able to relay those to people is really important, regardless of the conclusions people draw. Just laying out the patterns, the way you look at movies and see the patterns of the delivered messages and the symbolism, and being able to deliver that to people allows them to have that sort of format in their brain to maybe see it more. Like, I don't have great pattern recognition like that. I also don't have an in-depth level of historical knowledge or theology as you and many other people, but I know that by practicing it, it gets better. You can see things better, wider. Absolutely. And I think people are doing that, and I think that's a natural thing that needs to happen, because we get such small bits of information so fast that all of these attention deficit disorders and all this stuff is just a reaction to small bits of information. And so these longer periods of talking with people, like people are consuming a lot more of this kind of thing now, which is cool, because they're getting larger bits of information that they can digest and see on a wider scale, versus this very quick, superficial bits. Like I look at it like the media and Hollywood and all of the powerful entities, they are just like dropping tiny fish food in the tank, and most people are just swimming to the top and eating whatever's there. They just eat it. And sometimes you have to be like the fish who's just kind of looking around in the corner and just watching it all and trying to piece it all together. And not everyone can do that, which is why there's a lot of people who cover different topics like yourself, but you guys are doing all good jobs, because you're collecting all the data, and you're presenting it in a way that people can understand, where they can see patterns that matter. Like, it matters to see the patterns. And the Greta thing, just like you said, is just another pattern. It's no different than Jesse Smollett bumping shoulders with someone at a party, and they're like, "Hey, you want to do something bigger? you want to do something bigger than the lines. How about something that's really going to make a difference? You want to make a difference, Jesse?
It reminds me
Jesse?
of that.
And that's how.
Do you ever see Confessions of a Dangerous Mind?
Yeah.
It's like that scene when the guy comes up to recruit. Is it George Clooney? Who plays the main role? Or is George Clooney playing the CIA guy? I can't remember.
Sam Rockwell.
That's right. Yeah, and he comes up and he's like, "Son, would you want to serve your country?"
Exactly.
And now that's more like 50s, 60s Cold War stuff. And nowadays it wouldn't be so much maybe the country unless they had already profiled you as a patriot. It would be more like the vegan climate animal agenda. You want to save the animals? Let's go raid some farms tonight. Oh, I actually knew a guy, by the way, who did this. This cracks me up because there's a guy that was from my hometown, and he was involved in some weird churchy type stuff back in the day. I always thought he was kind of a weird dude, and then he got super into PETA. Not pita bread, but PETA, right, for the animals. he was obsessed with pita bread. He got into PETA, and I remember back in 2004-05, he was like devoted to this. And his brother, who eventually became a professor at the university that I used to go to, set up a debate between me and this dude. And it was actually all three of us, because one was a PETA guy, one was a philosophy guy, and then there was me. So we had like a 3-hour debate about veganism, PETA, animal rights, and atheism. This is, I don't know, many, many years ago. Now, the weird part was that the guy had left the church that he was in totally, was totally committed to the PETA stuff. And the reason he got high up at PETA was because he snuck into one of the Tyson, I don't know, one of those big nasty food factories where, the chickens are all in little cages or whatever. So he filmed some footage in there, and the PETA people were in love with him for a while. And then it turns out his whole worldview collapsed when it came out that the PETA people were behind that dog killing farm. If you remember that story, where PETA was actually having dogs put to death, and it was this huge scandal maybe 4 or 5 years ago. Anyway, I'd say all that just to say that the reason that he went down this road was because he had adopted Darwinism. He went to college. He figured out that Darwinism was true. And if Darwinism is true, he reasoned, well, we're just the animals are our older brothers. And so it's essentially killing your great-great-great uncle to, eat them. And if you're not a cannibal, then you should be a vegan. And this led him down this crazy path. And it was all because he was propagandized by the Darwinism at the university level. And then it all came crashing down when these corporate he didn't realize that PETA and these kinds of things are like corporate controlled front type things. When he realized that, it all collapses. And the whole time I'm sitting there thinking, bro, I could have told you this the whole time. I watched the movie 12 Monkeys. And if you've seen 12 Monkeys, you know it's a big bunch of front. Like you're being used, right? Because the Brad Pitt character, who's insane, he's literally insane in the movie. It's his dad that runs the GMO company that's actually doing all the crazy stuff. Brad Pitt's insane, and he falls in and creates this vegan cult, right? The Society of the 12 Monkeys, which is dedicated to setting the animals free. So in many ways, again, I'm way off topic, but it's just an illustrative story that I can remember of a guy who got propagandized, and the whole thing collapsed when he realized that PETA was involved in having dogs put to death.
Well, it's interesting because even if you abandon a transcendent source for morality, your need for morality doesn't go away. It just gets transplanted onto something else that you could morph it and invert it into other things and justify a lot of different actions. That's not to say that people don't justify actions, religiously, but it's the same thing what you just said. It's like if you go down that road, you are giving yourself permission to rewrite the guidelines for morality based on. And the basis for it is just, like you said, well, no, we're all just accidents, and we're all related in some level. The dog is just a really early version or whatever. and you could just justify anything because it's all just one. It's like, what do you call it? Is it monism, or is that theological? Like
No,
I'm
it's
thinking like
fine.
everything is everything.
Yeah, I mean that's
Everything's
a version
everything.
of monism, right? Everything is essentially just one type of thing. It doesn't matter
Yeah,
what you
which
say.
sounds
Yeah,
yeah, it sounds so nice, and in a way, it's true in some respects. But there's a way to like really pervert that idea, and you end up going down some really dark paths because nothing matters. You can just say anything. You can just it's like what Sam Harris said when he was asked. Sam, but if there's no morality, then like how do I tell my kid to to make good choices and make moral choices? And what do I say to him? And he says, ironically, well you lie. He said you lie. And so which is such a funny thing that always stuck with me
I thought
because
the atheists were always mad that Christians are lying. It's like teaching your kid
lying.
about Santa
Exactly.
Claus. Santa
Exactly.
Claus is
That's
like God, is
exactly.
fairy God in the sky with a beard.
Exactly. And that's what's stuck with me is that it's self-refuting of the argument that religious people shouldn't lie to kids. It's child abuse. But he just said you lie, and so that was like, I don't know why that was such an eye-opener to me. And that moment of hearing that, because I did follow Sam Harris for a while. I was like, yeah, he's smart and he can use all these big words and talk around people. But then I just simply confronted the reality that I believe objective morality exists. And we talked about this before. Is it a different statement than morality is objective? And you said it's the same to some extent, but it can be different. You can break those two statements up. Does objective morality exist? Like, can we point to it? And I think the answer is yes. And I can't say that is true without while basing it on just my own personal human, just the idea of man creating it. It doesn't make sense. Then it reduces it back to subjective. So um, once you accept that you believe or that objective morality exists at some level, any level, it doesn't actually matter, because if it exists, that means it can't be given by just man. And so that logical premise sent me into so many crazy debates watching people like yourself and other people debate this stuff, and how it's not really presented in mainstream at all. Like these important questions that used to be front and center in culture. Like we're all pretending that these questions have been solved and we're going to leave God in the past. God is dead and all this shit. It's not even close. And it's just a big lie. And it is because if you bring up the conversation, people are very willing to enter the conversation. That's how you know it's not dead.
Yeah.
Atheists are very willing to join the conversation. And so I think that's cool. It's sort of a tangent, but I think it's all related. Like on a base level, that's what we're looking at. Everything that we're pointing out that people are doing, all the planning, everything has this underlying baseline moral claim. Greta has a baseline moral claim. And the question is, on what basis is it moral to listen to her and her ideas,
Exactly.
or the people behind her?
Yeah.
And once they realize that you can't answer that, or the answer is some weird thing like pragmatism is your basis for morality, we can explore that. It's going to get toppled in about 3 sentences, but and so that's kind of like my new favorite thing exploring, is like the only valid moral claim someone could make or refute is if they believe it's objective. That's the only way you can refute a moral claim. Because if you say, no, morality is subjective, you have no basis to refute any moral claim. And once you're in that crazy loop, I was there for like a week going, what the hell? This is crazy. But then it becomes very clear when people assume moral claims. Like my favorite is, if God exists, why would he do all of those terrible things? And I go, whose basis of morality are you using? You're using God's sense of morality against himself. So you're already saying, your argument already starts with God exists and his morality exists. But now you're just taking it, like Christopher Hitchens and used to do it all the time. Uh, Several centuries of suffering and death and teeth rot and all of this stuff, and he doesn't realize the whole time he was using like someone else's basis for morality.
If God exists, how come my sister is an art hoe?
An art hoe.
So what it made me think of was, one thing that's helpful in kind of sketching out a basic way to categorize all possible worldviews, and this can be done in philosophy. This is kind of one of the areas where when I tutor or teach people philosophy, I'll start out. I'm not trying to offend you or say that you're a noob or anything like that. I'm just saying for the sake of the audience, just for the sake of the audience, that you can sketch out about 3 or 4 basic positions that almost all religions and worldviews will fall into. Not every single religion, because some are unique, but most of the time you can pigeonhole it into about 4 or 5 different starting points. So most religions or worldviews will be monistic. And this doesn't have to just be materialism. It could be materialism. In our day, most monistic worldviews are definitely materialist. They think that all that exists is, solid physicalism, matter. And basically, when you say monism, you're saying that all and everything that exists is that thing, just that one thing. Every now and then you might bump into a weirdo philosopher who thinks that ideas are really what exists. And so even though it seems like things are physical, really physicality also is just an idea. So sometimes there are philosophers who are idealists who are also monists. Now, it's real easy to refute that. One thing I would say is that if we still want to be logical, if we still want to be rational, if we still want to be cogent and coherent, monism is incoherent because pretty consistently we have to make distinctions. We have to talk about that thing not being that thing. I'm not the bunion on Joe Rogan's foot, right? I'm not. I mean, it may seem like I am, but I'm not. I'm not the STD wart upon the testicles of Bill Cosby. It may seem like I am, but I'm actually not. I'm distinct from that thing, and so are you, right? And we all, therefore, do not want to be those warts or bunions. So we all implicitly do believe we are distinct from other things. I mean, it would be utterly nonsensical and absurd to believe that there are no distinctions and that no distinctions are real. And ultimately, some of those worldviews do go there. Like the Far Eastern systems typically do go into full-on metaphysical monism and say, yeah, actually what you need to do is meditate, sit on a mountain, roll around in your feces, and stare up at the sky, and you'll realize after 10 years that all things are one. And you'll realize that all distinctions are illusions. That's absurdity. That's stupidity. No, it's not bad to be different. It's not bad to have distinctions, right? So most world philosophies and religions, once you realize that they're premised on that dialectic of one versus many, of the collective versus the, then you're kind of already ferreting out most of the mistakes in human history. I know that sounds crazy, but it really is kind of that simple. You can move on from monism and talk about dualism. Some religions have said, yeah, you know what, that monism stuff is dumb. So, you know what, everything is just 2 different things fighting, positive and negative electrons, day and night, black and white, good and evil. And these are real forces, and they're just always fighting throughout. And so all of history is like Zoroastrianism or, some kind of weird dualism or whatever. But there's really no overriding principle if everything is in tension. If everything is in dualistic tension and the good is just as equal to the bad, then they necessitate one another. And yet you actually get some philosophies, sort of Luciferian or Masonic philosophies and Gnostic philosophies who will literally say that. They'll literally say good is just the flip side of evil. Evil is the flip side of good. But if that's the case, good and evil are relativized. They need one another. They feed on one another. So we can't have that philosophy. That breaks down into stupidity and self-contradiction at a very basic level. As we said, the other option could be to say, okay, well, I don't accept monism or dualism. I just accept that we kind of like meditate into negation, into some kind of thusness. We just become one with all things, and we just sort of dissolve, right? Absorb into the unity of the all. This is absurd because this denies who you are. Why would you want? It's essentially a suicidal philosophy. Why would you want to absorb into the one, into the collective? Like, you're good. There's nothing wrong with you existing and being. There's no more satanic philosophy than the idea that you have to destroy the self. That's a suicidal satanic philosophy. It's nihilistic ultimately. And then the only other option possible from these starting points is to say, okay, well, I don't accept monism. I don't accept dualism. I don't accept, abnegation into total unity or the thusness of the universe. I just believe in total pure chaos. And some people do go that route. They say, well, it's total anarchism, it's total polytheism, paganism, hedonism, anarchism. Those are all manifestations of just a kind of fundamental chaotic worldview. And really, this is just a return to ancient paganism, right? Because ancient paganism, it would talk about different gods, it would talk about different principles, but really what dictates is the fates in ancient pagan religion. The fates even determine the destiny of you and the gods. So you can go with those options, and those are really the only basic metaphysical options you have. You don't have any other options. It's just the way you can look at all the history of religions, and they're all going to manifest those 3 or 4 options. Now, I think Orthodox Christianity is unique in that it avoids some of these dialectics that are fundamental presuppositional dialectics. But that's just a little primer on philosophy and metaphysics and how to approach these questions that I think is helpful. And you'll notice those patterns when you look at religions and debates and how people argue things out. But I think you hit on what's the central basic critique that's really an easy way to understand a transcendental argument or the presuppositional argument, which is just from ethics, which is just to say, look, if there isn't a God, then there's not objective moral standards. If there's not objective moral standards, then we're all kidding ourselves and we're playing a game. And it's not wrong to be hypocrite. This is one thing that's really funny that the atheists do. They'll be like, Christians are a bunch of hypocrites. Yeah, so what? What's wrong with being a hypocrite? Be a hypocrite all you want, bro. There's nothing wrong with that.
Yeah. Right.
In fact, you should excel at being a hypocrite.
Right. You would need to borrow morality of the hypocrite to use it against him. But if you don't believe in morality, how can you call someone a hypocrite?
Right.
Like, there's nothing wrong with it. Also, the dissolving into nothing thing. I've with everything you said, like you're referencing like, all of time and man and their transitions through all of these things, and I'm thinking like, oh, this is actually how my life went. Like, it started, Christian, religious, just listen to my mom and what she says and don't really think about it and explore it, just kind of like take it and be like, okay. But then breaking away from that and then exploring the Eastern stuff and then getting into meditation. I did like Vipassana, like the 10-day meditation. And this breaking away thing into nothing, into thusness is funny because it almost makes me think of like a meme comic, because the moment you think you've obliterated your ego into a million infinite pieces where you're nothing, you're still you observing that going like, I did it. I'm finally nothing. And it's like, it's self-refuting because you're still you viewing this illusion of yourself like dissolving into nothing and you don't exist and you're all connected to everything and you're still just you. Like, you can't not be you declaring that. It's still you declaring that.
Exactly.
So it's the same thing with same thing with free will.
Another way to point.
It's like who's saying they don't believe in free will?
Yeah, right. I mean,
there is no free will. Yes, there is. No, you can't tell me that. It's like gets into this battle of free will about it.
Yeah. You can always point out that if the manifestation of the world that we inhabit is fundamentally illusory or it's some kind of solipsism. Because I get that question a lot of times. Like, if people are new to philosophy, they'll say, well, how do you know that we don't exist in like a simulation or a dream? Or how do you respond to Descartes' evil demon? How do you know that an evil demon is not putting every sense experience into your head and you're just the dream? You're in the dream of a god, man. Well, because we all can agree, hopefully, that we do use logic, we do use reason, we do use truth and falsehood. We do use categories like good, evil, non-existence, existence, right? These are things that we utilize to talk about the world, to reason about the world, to live in the world, to interact with one another, to communicate. And if all of those things are not real, if they are phantasms, if they are merely simulations, if they are, there's different versions of this mistake, right, or this philosophical error, then what happens is that I also have to confront the fact that if I come to that truth, that's also part of the illusion.
Right.
So my learning of that truth is also illusory and it's stupid. So at a very fundamental level, once again, this monistic position or this sort of Maya position is fundamentally also relativistic, subjectivist, and self-contradictory at such a fundamental level that it can't even get off the ground.
Yeah, it just falls apart just by the statement alone. Just in a full circle.
Yeah, and sometimes you'll have people say, well, okay, but like if I don't believe in logic and reason and consistency, then what's wrong with me just accepting that, dude? What if I just say, yeah, I'm the dream of a God, man, and it's all fake, dude? Then you can't debate. Like you can't come to the table to debate because debate assumes that there are objective standards and that it's not just, a figment of your imagination.
You're also using the standard of language, whatever language you're speaking, to make that presupposition. So the whole thing of like, I could just declare this and logic, you're still within the...
you can't make sentences, right?
Yeah, you should. If you really believe that, it should sound more like, and then you're like, okay, man, now
I have the nihilist argument you can't defeat.
Exactly.
BTFO, bro. I just BTFO'd you.
In a way, that manifests itself when you see like people who can't debate and reason. They in protests and stuff. They go to that, and it's almost like in a way they do win because they're like nothing exists. So you're just screeching. So the whole me.
Well, this is where a lot of the typical sort of SJW type atheist Reddit person, they do immediately go into that mode. Absolutely.
Right. Yeah, and it's like a safe bet. You can't argue sound. I mean, you can't. You're basically denying all reason and logic, and in a way, you win. You win the battle, but you lose the war because you can't live life like that. You can't ask for how much the oranges are and stuff like that.
Exactly.
I've seen people try to debate away logic. They try to. Again, it's just you're back to language. You're back. That's logic. Like you can't escape the order that you're experiencing and using as an interface with reality. You can't escape that.
Logic is false.
The moment you try.
Logic is false.
Yeah, it's false.
That's false is within the domain of logic, true and false propositions.
Yeah, exactly.
Logic is not logical, is essentially what you're saying.
Yeah, I'm like super new on philosophy and logic. Like I told you the last time we talked, like just opening a logic book, you think it's simple, but it's not. It's difficult. It's simple, but it's difficult. And so it's I think it's really bizarre to me. Two things are very bizarre to me: that we don't learn Latin and we don't learn logic, like very young. Latin, I'm seeing just from very, surface level learning, YouTube, just looking up words. If you learn, the moment you start learning Latin, you're learning history. Like it teaches you the history of the word, how it's connected to the other things, how it applies today. Just very simple stuff like candidate means white robe, like very white robe. Like they used a candidate because they would bleach it and they would go out in public and the poor people and the people in the village or whatever would be like, oh, glistening white robe. We trust this person. And most people don't know the word candidate. And it's like all of these things tie together with reasoning too. So like the cleaner you are with your language and the more you know about history through words and the word, as I'm seeing every day, is that you can piece together the world and the understanding of nature and the reality you're looking at and the order of it. And I feel like there's a distinct operation trying to separate people from that access. And the fact that we no longer teach Latin, people say it's a dead language, and it's not. It's there are people who keep that language alive, and they're very powerful. And I was just looking at that and going, wow, there's a real disconnect. It's almost like when, what was it? Was it? I'm not sure. Newton. It was either Newton or someone else. They were breaking through in science, but they still had their faith, and the science entity took over the relationship that the people had to nature. So like the lab coats, the earliest lab coats, they just said, we're the ones like you got to trust the mathematicians and the people who can speak this language. And they sort of captured the language, and they acted as a conduit between what they're seeing, which is like God's creation, the nature of language, understanding reality in what you're observing and how it functions, and how to deliver that to people through language. And now we see it's been clearly hijacked. Like, people just believe the lab coats, and they create all this language, almost like a lawyer creates language to make the client not understand the thing. So you need the lawyer to understand, like, tell me what all of this means. And really, it's just convoluting language so that people don't understand things. I just see that happening, and I see that the disconnect between source languages like Latin, because we're speaking English and we're not learning the history of it all. And so if you don't learn the history of it all, it's easier for a culture to invert language and change definitions because no one's calling it out and being like, no, the history. I'm not just saying the dictionary word. I'm talking about the history of this word that's this many years old is a really powerful way to protect your culture and your values and everything, because it all exists in language. So if you hijack language, you can turn a culture upside down, and it's happening.
Yeah, no, you're right about that. I think the discovery of linguistic philosophy, you could date that back to Giambattista Vico. And then after Vico, you get the Marxist tradition actually latching on to linguistic philosophy and its importance. Marx actually studied philology like hours and hours and hours all day long, and because he understood that you could, in many ways, control society through terms. Nietzsche also understood this. Nietzsche talked about how morals, terms like vulgar, that comes from the lower classes.
Vulgari.
So linguistic philosophy is very important. But sometimes people I think they go overboard and they think that just because it can be weaponized, that's kind of the Nietzschean route. Like, because it can be weaponized, or the Marxist route, then it's always a tool of some elite, or it's but that's not true. There's a lot of metaphysics that goes into language. It's very fascinating, very important. I do think that, language, reason, logic do speak to and testify to what we read in John 1 about the Logos. So even though I do critique people who overly emphasize Logos as if it was an abstract principle, it's certainly true that abstract principles and logic do point us to the capital L Logos, definitely. But the capital L Logos is God. It's divine. It's a divine person. And I would say, too, that you're absolutely right when you talk about Latin, especially for the West, but more so, I think, in terms of biblical theology, or in terms of the history of the first 7 councils of, like, the Orthodox Church. They were primarily Greek. So the terminology, the New Testament's in Greek, right? We use the Septuagint, which is in Greek, the Greek translation of the Old Testament. Even though I'm not like a fluent scholar in Greek or anything, you do eventually learn that there's nuance and there's importance to those languages. So in our view, along with kind of the critique that we were doing a few minutes ago about monism and dualism and chaos and whatnot, there's also we would say, a revealed anthropology. All right, so there's a way to understand the makeup and psychology and anthropology of man that we think comes from Scripture and from our tradition. And so that's how we see salvation as healing. It's not just like psychotherapy. I'm not saying that, but it's a version of like supernatural psychotherapy where the human person is healed, and you could see the church kind of like, in our view, a spiritual hospital, if you will, where the purpose of all this is the healing of the whole man, like body, soul, and nous, which is spirit in the Greek. When I encountered the idea of nous, this was very fascinating because it's something that was essentially kind of dropped off in the history of Western thought and Western Christianity, but maintained in Eastern and Orthodox Christianity. So this is why, for us, man is a triad. Man is a tripartite being. He has a body, a soul, and a nous. And he's not just body and soul / intellect. And so what happens in the West is you get this very interesting development where Western man sees the soul more or less as just one faculty, the intellect. And so soul / intellect smushed with body is what man is. Man is this dyad, this duopartite or whatever composition. And that's why you get such a stress on intellect. But what's been removed is the nous, which is not like Plato's nous. That's something else. It's actually the heart of hearts. It's man's innermost heart, his heart of hearts, you could say. And that's how man connects with and knows God. And so in our view, in the fall, it's that inner heart of hearts that was darkened. And that's why Paul in Romans 1 can say that that the universality of idolatry, the universality of worshiping sticks and rocks and stones and attributing to created things divinity, is a darkening of man's heart of hearts. He says it was manifest to them within them. And this is very different than the way that the West eventually conceives of man's moral law and duty towards God. For example, Aquinas, he views Romans 1 as if God made it evident through syllogisms and through Aristotelian logic and reasoning that you could reason to there being a first cause. That's not what Paul's talking about. Paul even says in Acts 17, if you've not read Acts 17, it's very relevant. I would say go and read Acts 17 because that's where Paul actually debates with a bunch of Greek philosophers. And the way Paul does apologetics is to say, not a bunch of Aristotelian syllogisms. I'm not saying you can't make those kinds of arguments to utilize syllogisms, but that's not how he approaches them. He approaches them by saying that your idolatry is morally wrong and you know it in your heart of hearts, and the word, the logos, is very close to you. He's near you, even in your hearts. So even the most furthest reaches, still the logos interpenetrates even the most degenerate pagan man, because you can't escape Christ. You can't escape that logos. That's the proper way to utilize logos in apologetics, and that's what Paul does in Acts 17. He doesn't do natural theology. He, in fact, tells them that you are accountable to the logos, the person Christ, the second person of the Godhead. That's revealed theology. That's natural revelation. That's not natural theology. Anyway, I'm sorry for going down that rabbit hole, but I did it because it's a very important distinction between Orthodoxy and the totality of the West. None of that is in the West at all. None of what I said is in Western theology, and I think that this is something that speaks to the power of Orthodoxy in maintaining that tradition.
Well, the way you described it, it almost sounds like that third aspect, the nous, is the thing that we do recognize when we know something's right or wrong. That might be independent of intellect or the soul, where we're drawn toward good, the good in us and others, and we know that exists. We cannot deny it. I mean, I have tons of atheist friends. They know good exists. They know the good in them. They want the good in others, and you just can't have good. If you're going to live your life pretending it's just an illusion, then you can't. That's no good.
Yeah. So part of the reason that a lot of people make a mistake at this juncture, and you're right there, is because they will look at the intellectual side of things, and they'll look at the physical side of things, right? Because man is body and man is soul. And they'll say, well, if those are the two kinds of categories, then really all we can do about the world is reason about things of the spirit in terms of like intellect and mind,
Right.
or things of the body. So those are the only two kinds of things that you can do. And so you either know a lot about intellectual things or you know a lot about physical things in science. And we would say that's kind of a division that shouldn't be there, because just as man is a holistic being, so also we should view reality in a holistic way. So reality isn't just physical any more than man is just physical. But man is also not just intellect. We aren't Gnostics. Man has a body. So the body does matter, and the body is part of, this is why, for example, in Orthodox Christianity, the body participates in liturgy, right? It's not just a thing where you go and listen to a pastor talk to you for an hour about something. You're actually standing and you're bowing and you're, doing the cross and so forth. We have icons. We have all these things that are touchy, sensational, because the body matters. But the thing with the nous is that nous is essentially what happens when we begin to pray and when we seek God in our heart of hearts. And what this does, it doesn't destroy the faculties of body or soul/intellect. It reorients them into the proper harmony. So rather than me saying, I'm going to know God primarily through rationality and intellect or through sensational sense experience, I know God in my innermost heart of hearts primarily. And then the other faculties in me come into harmony. They work in unison, right? They're no longer divided and split. I'm no longer, in a way, you could say, I don't mean this like in a strict MK Ultra sense, but I'm no longer dissociated between the different aspects of my being. And I think that when you understand it in that way, you can actually almost say that the whole modern world is essentially structured to cause man to be dissociated. And I mean that in a spiritual sense, like a fragmented kind of mind control type of thing. And really that's what the whole modern world does, is essentially put us in a kind of mind control that isn't just CIA operatives. It's spiritual. It's ultimately man has a spiritual problem.
Right. Yeah. Well, that's kind of why, I mean, back to the way beginning of the conversation where, the left and right, the right is attacking me, and they don't realize that my view is not this political dialectic thing. I can toy with that and make fun of it and stuff and take a stance either in one direction, but it's really how I see everything now is definitely a personal spiritual battle of man, and it's so beyond politics or even the stuff we're talking about, like the Planopolises and all of this stuff. It still gets reduced to the spirit of man and the rejection of good and God, and trying to replace him, and all of the stuff that's occurring. It's all just all of the things we talk about and that you see are just indicators, symptoms of what you just said. And when people maybe revisit that, I mean, what that third aspect, the nous, is there a historical period that was purposefully removing that, or was it forgotten through some like mishap cultural transmission?
What happens in Western theology is that you get a development towards the dominance of Augustine, and I've read Augustine extensively. In fact, he was one of the reasons that initially I was into Catholicism, was that I read City of God when I was 21. Then I read Confessions. I read all the anti-Donatist works. I read all the anti-Pelagian works. And then I read a bunch of the other doctrinal works, retractions, etc. And I realized that, especially in On the Trinity, what happens is that you get a difference in not just anthropology, but also the doctrine of God, the doctrine of who God is, what is possible and not possible for God. So basically you get kind of these, what could more or less be said to be Neoplatonic presuppositions that are still carried over, because Augustine was for many years a Neoplatonist. So he carried some of those positions over into his Christianity, unfortunately. And in many of the early church battles, they're actually battling with Greek philosophic presuppositions, and particularly Neoplatonism for many, many years. Later on, Neoplatonism kind of dies out, and then the church has to deal with other Hellenic type of errors, but more or less the errors are pretty consistently dialectical. And one of those errors is to kind of smush man's hypostasis, or his person, into his nature. And that's kind of what happens with Augustine, is that you don't get a full understanding of the importance of the nous and the importance of distinctions that don't imply composition or division, especially in God. Anyway, that's really abstract, but this progresses by the time of up to Anselm. You get assumptions about what happens in the crucifixion that can't really be reconciled with Orthodox theology, namely that God is paying God an infinite debt, satisfaction of debt. This actually goes into later penal substitution theory of the Reformers. Orthodox doesn't have any of that. It doesn't make any sense to say that God's paying God for a debt. That's all sort of absurd. That's actually some of the atheist critiques about Jesus paying off God for an infinite debt that God owed God. I mean, they're kind of right, because they're actually hitting on theological problems in Anselm. So I could actually give some credit to the atheists on that point, because we don't believe that. We don't believe that God's paying God an infinite debt. That's absurd. But anyway, so a lot of these same issues that you're talking about there, they're connected, and they do kind of come to fruition in the late Middle Ages, the time of Aquinas, the time of Barlaam, the time of St. Gregory Palamas. And so there's a bunch of debates in the 13th, 14th century between the Palamites, who are the Orthodox, and the Latins over these issues. There's an attempt at reunion at the Council of Florence, and it doesn't work. So there were debates over these issues, but it never was really resolved, and hence why there's still an Orthodox church and a Roman Catholic church.
Yeah, interesting. Wow, you have a lot of memory space in there.
Could be. Maybe I'm an augmented lesbian black AI.
That's true. That's also true. It's also possible.
Who's wearing a white guy suit?
You're just got a white guy suit on. I listened to a critique you had of William Lane Craig, and because I like watching his debates, and I just love watching theists and atheists debate stuff, and they give each other the full effort. But you pointed at something that was really interesting that I took with me, which was while he has really cool logical setups, and he's just well-rounded in being able to set up the framework to annihilate something that doesn't have logic. You pointed to the fact that his premise, I guess, still leaves people interacting with the scientific material approach. I think is how you put it. It was like what he was the arguments he was presenting, while they sounded like well crafted, they were still leaving it in the realm of science and materialism. Like we can, like every time he goes to like any kind of reference to something we know of science, or something we know of the material, it just leaves it open to be diminished later if that changes. In other words, does that make sense? Like we know this is about biology. We know this about XYZ. It's observable. If that changes, if that's your argument for faith, then if that changes, then it can it could hurt your argument if you're basing faith off of science. That makes sense? I'll send you the thing. It may have been old. It was just an audio.
Yeah, no,
it wasn't
I
a video.
found it. I put it in the chat actually for anybody that was interesting. So I did dig up my old because I reposted that maybe a few weeks ago. But yeah,
I may have also totally misrepresented it. I just
no,
trying
I think
to
I know
remember
what you're getting at. So basically, there's a distinction in the history of theology between different schools of apologetics. And so William Lane Craig is most known for being an apologist, and certainly he has a lot of good stuff in certain areas. Like, for example, I recommend his book on creation. Actually, he has a really good book that's been in my recommended reading list for several years on ex nihilo creation. It actually shows the unique aspects to which the Genesis account presents creation as an ex nihilo, which distinguishes our worldview from many of the other cosmogonies and pagan origins. So, for example, if you were talking to somebody who was like of the zeitgeist crowd and they were like, well, Christianity is just like Egyptian mythology or whatever. No, actually, there's like 10 specific areas of Genesis that are completely unique and different than any of the ancient pagan cosmologies. But so that book's really good. Other areas I feel like William Lane Craig is really weak, and that was kind of what I was trying to hit at in that discussion, was that his apologetics is a weird attempt to meld both classical arguments, classical foundationalism as a epistemology, and he at times tries to use transcendental arguments. So because I'm a big proponent of transcendental arguments and presuppositionalism, to be consistent, I can't also say that classical foundationalist epistemology and those arguments are always the best or solid or valid at all times. They're not. And so what I was kind of getting at in that talk was showing how when he critiqued this atheist dude, there was an atheist agnostic TED talk or something. And so William Lane Craig was critiquing that, and I was critiquing the critique. So I was doing like a critique of two different dudes engaging and showing how both are wrong, and the transcendental argument is just superior. It's much stronger. And there's a funny debate that William F. Buckley, of all people, is hosting between some atheists and William Lane Craig. And William Lane Craig gives like 5 transcendental categories in a transcendental argument against the atheist. It's like a 2 or 3 minute clip. It's had like 1 million views. And so, yeah, that's good arguments. He's using transcendental arguments. And then he's turned around and he says, oh, but the Kalam cosmological argument is a good argument. No, it's not. And the reason it's not is that principally, I mean, there's a lot of different ways that I would go about critiquing that approach. But it's not enough to just say that I can find an argument that points to some common first cause or common accepted generic principle like causality or teleology or whatever, and then thereby join with all of these other cults and sects and weirdos and loons who could make the same argument, and I could join hands with all them against an atheist. That doesn't work. And it doesn't work because when I'm granting the disunity and the lack of clarity in my view by joining with a Satanist, one could join with a Satanist and believe in a first cause. That's a dumb, stupid argument. But you quite literally could. I mean, theoretically, a Satanist could say, I believe there's a first cause. Oh, by the way, it's Satan. And so am I going to, oh, well, we have the same apologetic against the materialist? No, that's stupid. That's dumb. Right. But that's literally where that argument goes. And they all know this, by the way, which is really weird. It's like they know of this criticism of these theistic arguments. I just think they're really bad. They're really weak. They're really dumb. And smart atheists will call this out. Okay, not every atheist is a total low IQ person. Smart ones will call it out, and they'll say, you've already surrendered the strength of your argument and your position if you're joining with all these cults and these idiots to try to prove what? A first cause? Well, if you're only proving that, what is that? That doesn't mean anything. I could remain an atheist and admit some generic first cause. Okay, the first cause was the Great Big Bang.
Right. Yeah. Just say. Well, the same problem exists when, and I've dug myself this hole because I wasn't educated enough, but I was very, very anxious and about morality, which was, without God, there's no objective morality. And so the next phase of that argument for someone who's prepared on the other side can say, well, what God? Then now you're just comparing gods. I can just say whatever God. So you have to be prepared in understanding the nature of the Christian God in the Bible and why that exemplifies good.
Right.
And I'm actually still not knowledgeable enough to defend it, but my sense is that good must be God. Like God must be good. Like you can't say there's good and evil, good and bad, and all this stuff without a standard. You need a standard for love, and you need a standard for good, and you need a standard for living life, a good life. And my the only place it pointed me was that separates from other objective claims of morality and life and how a God, I guess, in a lot of other cases, exists as the source, is that God, being made in the image of God, is what allows us to understand how to love how to love other people, because we can see we are in the image. So, which is distinct from a four-arm, six-arm elephant. Like you can't love the person that somehow is embodying the belief of the elephant, like these other mythical creatures that you don't know love because you're not looking at the image of God. Does that make sense? It could be wrong. I just
I think
was exploring this, you can't love that elephant or Buddha's he's a dude and he's kind of like big, but it's that point alone is what draws me in, actually, which is like, how do you know what the standard of love is and how to express it to another if they're not made in the image? Like, you can't know. Otherwise you're getting into the loving the tree and praying to the tree, and you start morphing the embodiment and the person. And so, that's where I am, actually, like in all of this, and it's all very still new, like rediscovery of all of this. And I'm like, I know that there's good. I know that there's evil. I know that I believe in objective morality, that it exists, therefore God exists. So my best, like I told someone once, when they said, well, then how do you know which one? And I go, you got to read them all, I guess. You just got to see which one logically makes the most sense for what you know in your heart is good and represents that. That's all I could do, because I just don't have enough information.
Well, I would say probably the next question that would come about would be in a person's sort of process would be, after we've kind of realized the problems of monism and dualism and Maya and chaotic nihilistic worldviews, is that we might think, okay, well, there's got to be, some kind of God. The next question typically is something like, and you're right to talk about goodness and love, the good or whatever. Those are fine to talk about. But typically the question is, okay, but is this a personal God or is this an impersonal God? And this would suggest also a distinction with a lot of other world religions, because a lot of world religions might say, okay, but there is some kind of beginning or some kind of first cause. There is some kind of absolute. That's a term that's oftentimes used, maybe in perennial philosophy or whatever. But the key question that distinguishes like the biblical view is that God is not just a force. God's not abstract. We're not New Agers. God isn't just some, Star Wars type force. God is personal. And so there is, as you mentioned, this image of God in man. We can form an analogy between the fact that when human persons have communion, we interact and we understand what it's like to commune with one another through, knowing each other, talking to each other, getting to know each other, et cetera, et cetera. That is a model also for how we relate to God, to having that personal communion. And this is important because, like with ancient Greek paganism or Greek philosophy, you can't have a relationship with a number. You can't have a personal relationship with, an abstract force. You can only have that kind of relationship with a being that's personal. And that's why the next step is usually to ask the question of, is God, impersonal or personal. And then the terms like good and the terms like love make a lot more sense because it makes sense to have a relationship with a deity that's personal. And likewise, when we talk about reality reflecting things like math and logic and formal principles, those also suggest information. And information science, for example, tells us that information comes from a mind.
Right.
Information doesn't come out of nowhere. It comes from some kind of conscious mind. And so just as I have reason and logic, right, and thought, and my mind produces things, so in an analogy, as the church fathers often say, the God created the world on the basis of his divine mind. It has order, it has structure, it has these principles that undergird it. It has this logos that is in creation. We in Orthodox theology is called the logi, right? It permeates. That's the logos in creation, in his many creatures, permeating all things, being at root the basis and the meaning of all things. That's not pantheism. We're not identifying God with creation, but we're saying that God is present in creation. So that is what I would say would be probably the next philosophic step that we could take towards understanding the type of deity that we're talking about here. And then when you kind of flesh this out, the deeper that you go into it, you realize that, okay, well then there's other attributes that kind of come along with the theology that also makes sense. For example, we wouldn't hold these things and then say, but that God is not omnipresent. Like we say he's all good and he's personal and he's all loving, but he's not over there in that place. Right, that wouldn't make any sense, right? It wouldn't make any sense to say that he's, well, that's all true, but he came into being yesterday, like he just popped into existence yesterday. No, he's eternal, right? And because he's all good and he's all loving, he's also eternal. So these things start to flesh out, they start to stack up, and we start to get a better understanding. And this is what theology does. Theology sort of reasons out. It's not just reasoning like abstractly, but it's also getting this information, these truths from what we call revealed theology, and that's where Scripture comes into play.
Interesting. I think this conversation, this point has been made before, perhaps, but someone asked me why believe in a God? Like to understand, we don't need God to understand all of these things. And I said, well, from a strictly logistical standpoint of like studying something that in Dawkins' words has only the illusion of design, coming from a place that there is a designer, just from a standpoint, can probably catalyze understanding of what we're seeing. Like if we just like looking at anything, like if you look at something that's made and you question, how is that designed? Like if you want to reverse engineer something and understand it, just coming from the perspective that it's been designed allows you to interact with it the same way what we just said is like understanding how to interact with a person, knowing that they're in the image of someone else. And so like that whole way of looking at it would be so advantageous and has been historically for science historically, but they've removed that aspect of like the curiosity of looking at something from a design standpoint to understand it is totally logical. It makes total like sense. If you're going to look at it, you don't say that has the illusion of design. Let me see how it wasn't designed, so that I can then figure out how to design the thing that I just said wasn't designed. It doesn't make any sense to come from that approach. Also, on a side note of that Dawkins argument, if design is an illusion, then your entire argument for randomness must also be an illusion. You can't just be like, no, design's an illusion, but randomness is not an illusion. That's just totally real, because randomness would also just be an illusion. You can't be You can't cherry pick one and not the, you know what I mean? Like that doesn't, how could you prove randomness? How can you prove something's random?
Exactly. I mean, randomness does presuppose order to be able to distinguish, to contradistinguish between the randomness and the order, right? I mean, pattern recognition, this is all based on principles of logic, principles of demarcation, predication. All those things go into doing pattern recognition and to distinguishing objects from other objects. So that's a very complex, obviously it utilizes a lot of different transcendental categories. And yes, absolutely, teleology and cosmology are transcendentally necessary categories. You can't get away from using them. Now, the atheist is correct to point out, in my view, that just a bare cosmological argument is a really weak, bad argument. It doesn't prove what it seeks to prove. But it's fine to do a teleological argument or a cosmological argument if you reframe them as transcendental arguments, and they are, because they're assumed. You can't talk about the external world. You can't talk about purpose in the external world or causation in the external world without assuming that there are real categories that exist. Otherwise, your speech becomes nonsensical, right? Events become incoherent. Events become meaningless. If you just think design is a subjective construct, then you fall back into total relativism. So you have to presuppose that there is design. It's not just in the mind. Numbers, geometrical patterns, categories, these aren't just in the mind. They're actually in the world. This is really low IQ, stupid stuff. But this is the kind of stuff that we have to deal with. And the Dawkins, Hitchens types, they just sort of rehash stuff from the 1700s as if people haven't responded to this, as if there's no answers to it, but there is. Are you cool with reading some super chats before we head on out?
Yeah, totally.
All right, we got Philip of Voraios. Thank you for joining, Philip. He's a new member to the channel. Remember, everybody, you can subscribe to Jay's Analysis in the YouTube memberships if you want to. Some of those people don't want to go to the website, but you can also still go to Jay's Analysis and subscribe by purchasing a membership to all of the archived content. Many interviews, many lectures on all kinds of topics. I'll leave that link in the chat box right now, so you can get your membership there. You can also, if you click on that, you can go over to the shop at Jay's Analysis and get signed copies of my book. Doorman360 says, $2. Would you visit me in my tiny house? Ladies love it. How do ladies fit in your tiny house? I don't think they do. So I don't buy that, Doorman. JimBob, will you visit him in his tiny house?
No, I don't think so.
He says no. Josh, $2. He says, Jay, please make another Pastor Randy Balls. I'm glad you like Pastor Randy Balls. I have had a lot of requests to do another Randy Balls video, so I guess eventually I'll have to get on that. Amy Polino, $20. Thank you, Amy. Wow, that's a fat super chat. She's always dropping them 20s. Who's on a 20? Franklin? I'm not Franklin.
I think.
Franklin's on the 100. Who's on?
Yeah.
Jackson? Andrew Jackson? Anyway, she's dropping them Jeffersons. Womp womp, $5, 5 A's. I just found out that one of my 18th century ancestors was an orphan raised by the Royal Society. Can I get a Bayes analysis? A Bayes analysis of your orphan ancestor? I'm not going to do that. I'm not going to track down no genealogical research on the Womp Womp family. Or do you mean a Bayes analysis of the Royal Society? That I can do, because they, along with the Jesuits, by the way, are the main progenitors of the Darwinian mythos. Of course, they were the brains behind the British Empire. So we've talked about the Royal Society many times. A lot of talks on that. Evan Schultz, 12. Do you have anything to add on that, by the way?
No.
Okay. Evan Schultz, $12. Hello, nerds. Hello, nerd Evan Schultz. You're welcome here.
What up?
Some dude, Sam, $2. Feminism is fundamentally monistic. I guess perhaps you could say that if you adopt the goddess side of things, the tendency is to say that the goddess represents, like Isis and all of nature, right? Isis is like all of space and extension in space and so forth. So I could see maybe if you go down the goddess route of feminism, but it seems that in terms of like on the day-to-day practice, it's always in tension, fighting with patriarchy and
Well,
in the system.
Well, it depends what you mean by feminism. It's not like it's an easy answer.
I think you have a better JBP than I do.
No, I would listen to yours. It's on par.
Yours is better. I can't get mine to stop. It sounds too, I don't know. It sounds actually like,
you know what it is?
It sounds like the dude
You're
who
still
used to
happy.
call into Ralph's show and do it is the only thing I can do. So yours is actually better.
You have to feel darker inside a little bit.
Thomas W. 5. I joined the Catholic Church, then I discovered your channel, and now I think I'm going Orthodox. Thank you for all the high IQ thought. Thought or thought? I will be your high IQ thought. Let me get some booty pants and shorts on, and I'll model those for you, Thomas W. But I'm glad that you are interested in Orthodoxy. Don't think Frank will be the way you want to go, so stay away from old Pope Frank. Rolfling Stakes, $10. Are there any church fathers or Christian theologians that debate Buddhism or Eastern philosophy? Yes, I have an analysis I did of Father Stefan Rose's book, Orthodoxy and the Religion of the Future. And in that book, he takes on Buddhism, Hinduism in many chapters. And then there's also a much larger, more philosophic book called The Tao of Christ. And that's Hieromonk Damascene, who worked with Father Stefan Rose. He wrote a book taking on the Far Eastern thought and kind of pointing out that what a lot of the Far Eastern religions are searching for in this idea of the transcendent Tao is actually the Logos. So that's a famous book.
That's really funny. It makes me think of a possible cartoon where someone's trying to debate a monk and they're just not talking. They either win or lose if they just don't talk. A true monk would just sit in silence during that debate. Possible meme idea.
That is a good idea. So, by the way, Father Stefan Rose also covered aliens and UFOs. Here's my talk. I did a talk on it. If you want to check that out, I'll put that in the chat right now. And there is Orthodoxy and the Religion of the Future. So he talks about the New Age and the Hinduism and UFOs and all this goofy stuff, and he does a really good job exposing that. It's a kind of a classic book. It's converted a lot of people, a lot of New Agers. Private Death, $10 or $5. Do a Jordan Peanut Butterson Ben Shapiro debate. It would be hilarious. Hint, hint. I don't know. I mean, I'd have to like.
You can be Peterson, and I'll do Shapiro.
Well, can you do Ben Shapiro? I don't know. Mine's not good. I just had to speed it up on the program. I couldn't do it.
That's all you do. You just speed it.
Just put it into. Speed it up. You have to do 120.
I really need to shave. There's so many people. I just want to.
You do good impersonation.
I can't.
You're good at it. So.
Thanks. You too.
That would be a good debate. Country Rhythm Bear, $1.99. Thoughts on Doug Wilson? I assume you mean Doug Wilson by Douglas Wilson. I don't have a very high opinion of Doug Wilson. He's actually totally incompetent when it comes to Orthodox theology, and he's written some really, really bad articles on it. So I don't have a whole lot to say on Doug Wilson. But anyway, that looks like that's all the super chats. We had a big audience. We had almost 500 tonight. That's a big crowd for
awesome.
Me tonight. And thank you for bringing probably most of those. Do the JimBobs have a term? There's bears. There's nerds. Is there the Bobs?
Trolls, savages.
Savages. Okay, that works.
They're kind of all. I mean, there's such a mix. It's like it's hard sometimes to understand the pulse of who everyone is and what they think and believe, and it's all just overlapping most of the time.
Cool beans. All right, so I've got his Insta there. Everybody be sure and follow him on Insta. You'll see all those cool cartoons he does. And anything else you want to shout out? Anything coming up?
Yeah, I'm looking at doing, I was looking at Patreon, but I think enough people swayed me away from there because I might just get canceled. To Subscriber Star, I'm going to be launching that because I want to start putting more time into animating and doing those kind of funny bits that will likely be taken down from Instagram. So I'd rather keep them up on a separate account and also not piss off my current base who are like, I just want memes. I don't want all this stuff. So I'm creating a place where people can support me and allow me to expand on more complex stuff like animation, longer bits, and talking and behind the scenes stuff, and just things that I want to make that take a little more energy and resources. But specifically the animation, I really want to make. I think there's a need for really funny, crazy, savagery. That's like ideally like South Park level, but tackling more of this kind of
well,
content.
I got the book, and by the way, I need to send you my book. But so thank you for sending me savage memes. It's based, it's very funny, and also and people can get that if you go to his Instagram. You'll see the link to his website where you can buy the book, and also you can get my books, Esoteric Hollywood 1 and 2. Remind me, JimBob, and I will send you copies of my books too, since you sent me yours.
Awesome. Yeah.
So all right, everybody, thank you. Looks like we got one more super chat from Richard Rawl, $5. Thank you for the cool stream. Well, thank you, Richard. We appreciate it. Love all you guys. Until next time, hope you enjoyed it. God bless. Have a good night.